to you all, and I bring greetings and solidarity from my trade union branch, who fully support this educational exhibition. I'm going to talk about the experiences of the lesbian, gay, transgender and bisexual community who lived under the Nazi regime both before and during the Second World War. And then I'm going to talk a bit about how an anti-LGBT legacy lives on and how this affects us all today. Information sources on this are relatively few. A lot of the survivors, the LGBT survivors of the concentration camps, didn't leave written accounts of their experiences because these would have incriminated them. A lot of them weren't able to talk about their experiences, it was psychologically too difficult. And when some of them tried, it did make them feel quite physically sick. The survivors of the camps tended to find themselves in a significantly more hostile environment after the Second World War than what they experienced in the 1920s and for some of them in the 1930s, when some were able to enjoy considerably more freedoms. So that's my starting point, the 1920s, 1930s. 1920, 1921, the German National Socialist German Workers' Party was founded, and they had their paramilitary wing, brown shirts, the stormtroopers. They were founded under the leadership of an out gay man by the name of Ernst Röhm, who was their leader on and off for a number of years. Sorry, I should pronounce it Röhm. I can't speak a word of German, so my pronunciation is going to be a bit suspect. Röhm had an interesting relationship with Hitler. They were very, very close. They were on first-name terms, which was quite unusual. Hitler didn't seem, on the surface, too concerned about Röhm's homosexuality early on, though it did increasingly become a problem. But the Nazi Party, in general, was very concerned about it, because they were of the view that Röhm sort of flaunted his homosexuality in a way that was distasteful to them. The socially conservative German officer class didn't like Röhm either, because they thought, for understandable reasons, that he wanted to take over the leadership of the German military, and they also didn't like his homosexuality either. It's worth mentioning that the deputy leader of the brown shirts was also an out-gay man as well, and when he was assassinated, to the night of long nights, he was found in bed with his lover, and there were a number of Nazi top brass that were gay as well. It's interesting because this formed the basis of the book that was published in 1935 by an American evangelical Christian pastor and barrister who tried to put forward the view that the Nazi Party, with its ideologies and all the atrocities that it committed, all stemmed from the gay community, which is an absolutely bizarre idea. I would love to buy this book and read it, but I just cannot bring myself to pay money for such nonsense. So that's the paramilitary wing of the Nazi Party, and as we all know, it had a youth movement as well, known imaginatively enough as the Hitler Youth. They were the only legal youth organisation in Germany at that time. Now, same-sex relationships were not uncommon in the Hitler Youth, and in the early days they were tolerated, to the extent that in some quarters the Hitler Youth was derided as the Homo Youth. And very embarrassing for its leadership, there was a 3-year period just before the war when 4,000 young lads were expelled from the Hitler Youth for same-sex activity. Relatively speaking, given their membership, it's quite a drop in the ocean, but it was enormously embarrassing for the leadership. So in 1928, there were an estimated 1.2 million out homosexual men living in Germany. Germany had a thriving gay liberation movement under the leadership of a chap called Magnus Hirschfeld. He was the director of the German Institute of Sexology. He was everything that the Nazis hated. He was gay, he was a liberal, and he was a Jew. It's a miracle how he managed to survive and get away with his life. So Hirschfeld was an interesting man. He was constantly lobbying the Reichstag to get them to have debates on the illegal nature of same-sex relations in Germany. And in 1929 they did have a debate as to whether to decriminalise same-sex activity between men. And it was very narrow. It wasn't decriminalised, but that was the last chance that he had. So Hertzfield did a lot of helpful things for the LGBT community, and he was a bit of a world pioneer, but he also did some unhelpful things as well. Hertzfield was a physician, and he put forward the view that gay men certainly constituted a third sex, and he tried to prove this scientifically by taking various measurements of gay men and straight men, and then putting forward the view that they were a third sex. And the Nazis absolutely loved this, because they were able to say, look, the gay community itself is saying that they're not real men, that they're weak, that they're effeminate. So he did some good and he did some bad. But there was a lot of pseudoscience going on at that time in terms of human sexuality. So there were a lot of gay clubs in Berlin during the 20s and 30s. It was, I suppose, the gay capital of Europe. The Berlin police were notoriously lenient when it came to enforcing anti-gay laws. There's a lot of resentment from other parts of Germany, more conservative parts, about this. So the LGBT community were able to build up a supportive community, and they had social venues to go to. So it was the place to be in the 1930s. Homosexuality was illegal in Germany, and it had been since 1871. I think that was the time when the Second Reich came together and Germany united. The anti-gay laws from the Prussian kingdom were incorporated into the united Germany. Wasn't the case all over Germany. Places like Hanover never had any laws prohibiting same-sex relationships. But the Nazis came to power in 1933, and that's when things started to go downhill for a lot of groups, including the LGBT community. Anything that had anything positive to say about it, any organisations, they were banned, individuals were arrested, and we were branded as parasites, degenerates, enemies of the state. The Gestapo instructed police departments to compile lists of known homosexuals. These were called pink lists. And then once the Gestapo got their hands on these, they were able to round people up en masse, arrest them and send them to prison, and very often they would then go on to concentration camps. So there was a vicious crackdown. A lot of gay people would end up in mental hospitals as well. Prior to 1935 and the revision of paragraph 175 of the Penal Code, which prohibited sexual activity between men, gay men who went to court, they had the option of being castrated. It was a voluntary thing. But the Nazis gave the courts powers to forcibly castrate people. So they were very, very dark times. So between 1933 and 1935, official figures show that there were 100,000 gay men arrested, an estimated 55,000 went to prison, and 15,000 went to the concentration camps. Many were simply murdered in cold blood by the thuggery of the brown shirts. They were official figures. There's a lot of unofficial activity that went on, of course. The rule of law didn't really mean very much. So Magnus Hirschfeld wrote to the Nazi Party and he said, can you please clarify what is your position on homosexuality? And this is the response he got. They wrote, it is not necessary that you and I live, but it is necessary that the German people live. And it can only live if it maintains its masculinity. It can only maintain its masculinity if it exercises discipline. Free love and deviancy are undisciplined. Therefore we reject you. Anyone who thinks of homosexual love is our enemy. So they're very clear about that. And Heinrich Himmler, who was obsessed with homosexuality, made it very clear to a group of German officers he was speaking to that ultimately Germany would need to rid itself of gay men. And he did mention gay men. I will talk more about the experiences of lesbians and trans people later. So that was made clear right from the start. Heinrich Himmler was an interesting character. So he was the head of the SS under Gestapo, and he had it in his head that all gay men ever thought about was sex, and they were obsessed with trying to seduce heterosexual men. And he also thought that homosexuality was contagious, Rudolf Hess thought this as well, which is why in Auschwitz, those who were there because of their sexuality, who were wearing the pink triangles, they were segregated from other parts of the camp. But Himmler became very frustrated because the Gestapo didn't have any jurisdiction within the German military, so they weren't able to root out gay soldiers, sailors, and airmen. That was very frustrating for him. And he was equally frustrated because he could not rid the SS of gay men. If any of them were caught in homosexual relationships, he wanted to deal with their cases personally, and the cases just kept coming in. And so he eventually ordered that if any of them were caught, then they had to be executed. So he was very, very obsessed. So we have some experiences from camp survivors. As I say, there aren't an enormous amount of them. So Heinz Dormer spent 10 years in and out of prison camps, and he wrote of hearing the haunting, agonising cries from the singing forest, which was a row of tall poles on which condemned men were hung. Everyone who was sentenced to death would be lifted up onto the hook. The howling and the screaming were inhuman, beyond human comprehension. So when the Nazis executed people, they didn't hang them with a drop. They had metal nooses put around their neck, and they were hung up on poles to slowly die. So a young Frenchman by the name of Pierre Seal, he lived in the German region, I think the French region, I think it's called Alsace, I don't know if I've pronounced that right. And Alsace was to become part of Greater Germany, and all areas that were to become part of Greater Germany had to criminalise homosexuality. And when he was 16, his pocket watch was stolen when he was in a snooker club. He went and reported this to the police. The police officer put two and two together, realised that it was a gay social venue, and he entered his name on the town's register of known homosexuals, with all the other known homosexuals. And nothing happened for a couple of years, it all went very quiet. Then Germany invaded a concentration camp, which was known as the Gay Auschwitz. There were gay men in all concentration camps, but Sachsenhausen seemed to have more. Pierre wrote that, outraged by our resistance, the SS began pulling out the fingernails of some of the prisoners. In their fury, they broke the rulers we were kneeling on, and they used them to rape us. Our bowels were punctured, blood spurted everywhere. When my eyes reopened, I thought I was in the back of a butcher shop. Anal and genital torture was a particular type of thing that the SS unleashed on gay people. It was very common. Now, while Pierre was at Sachsenhausen, he discovered that an ex-lover of his was being held there by the name of Joe. And one morning, all the pink triangle of the gay inmates were led out into the parade ground, and Joe, from a distance, was led out naked by the concentration camp guards. They put a metal container over his head to muffle his screams. They blared out very loud, triumphant classical music from the speakers. And then they executed him. And the manner of his execution was that he was mauled to death by Alsatian dogs, which severely traumatised Pierre. But of course, there was no place to breathe. And he recalled seeing the Alsatians biting into his thighs and hearing the screams of his. He couldn't watch anymore, but they were all ordered to watch. Pierre was subject to hormonal medical treatment, as were many of them. An experiment he was forced to take part in. He had female hormones injected into his nipples. A friend of his was subject to the same treatment and died of a punctured heart. And many died during these experiments. And it has to be said, the medical experimentation that was carried out gave absolutely no new knowledge towards medical science whatsoever. It was grossly inhumane, and it yielded absolutely nothing from the suffering that it produced. Many of the physicians, in fact, I think all of them worked without any supervision whatsoever, and the attendants that helped out in these experiments were also grossly incompetent as well. So it was an absolutely disgusting time. Now, one morning, Pierre was freed from Sachsenhausen, and he was very confused. He had to sign a document to say that he wouldn't talk about his experiences, and he was shown the door. And he was very suspicious. He left and he thought he was going to be shot on the way out. And so he went home as if nothing had happened. And then the next day he received his call-up papers and he was drafted into the German Labour Corps. He was a very fit and healthy young man. He was deemed as being physically useful to the German regime. The German economy at this point was very much fueled by slave labour. So he spent a few years doing that, and he had to keep his homosexuality to himself. Now, in 1943, the war started to very much turn against the German side, and Pierre was drafted into a fighting battalion that was sent to Yugoslavia. General Tito's resistance were giving the Germans the runaround, so it was a bit of a troublesome area. So he fought there, and then as the war came to an end, him and a German officer deserted. The officer got shot, and then Pierre eventually made his way home across Europe. It was a very traumatic experience, as they all were. But more from Pierre later. Another account was from a gay man called Klaus von Neuberg, who was also at Sachsenhausen. He wrote, "All prisoners with the pink triangle would be transferred as a unit to the cement works the next morning. The cement works, we all shuddered, for the human death knell was more than feared. As they were marching there, at a very fast rate, they were being whipped and beaten, and some people died on the march there as well." And he wrote that they were forced to drag along 20 corpses as a unit. The rest of us were encrusted with blood. We entered the cement works. We had been here for almost 2 months, but it seemed like endless years to us. When we were transferred here, we had numbered around 300 men. Whips were used on us more frequently each morning. And when we were forced down into the clay pits under the wailing camp sirens, somebody whispered to me only 50 of us were still alive. So then, that was over a 2-month period. 250 gay men were literally worked to death. And at the end of this experience, when they marched back, an older, kinder man who took him under his wing advised him to march back in the middle of the small group of men that were left, so that he wouldn't get hit by the whips and the batons as much. And remarkably, Clausen survived the experience as well. In 1940, Henny Sherman was arrested in Frankfurt, and she was sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp for women. On the back of her file and her ID paper, it was written that she was a licentious lesbian who only visited lesbian bars. That seemed to be her crime. She was later gassed at the Bernberg killing factory. Now, paragraph 157 of the German Penal Code didn't mention lesbianism, but the Nazi view was that lesbianism was alien to the nature of Aryan women. It was something that they wouldn't want to do, they wouldn't even wish to entertain. So they found it, and that they would find it quite grotesque. It was an interesting experience, well, a very different experience being a lesbian in the female concentration camp like Ravensbrück. For the men, the group they were in the concentration camp wasn't, well, it was a very sort of heterogeneous group, and they didn't tend to stick together very well and form cohesive, protective communities with each other. Apparently in the female concentration camps, there was more of a sense of camaraderie. So, for example, if a group of women were marching past a group of lesbians, they were ordered to turn their heads away in disgust. The women marching past always refused to do that, and some of them even looked at the lesbians. So the group of lesbians. So there was much more camaraderie amongst the women. It was sometimes very difficult for the men because the SS guards would take some of the younger gay men as lovers, and that would of course grant them a bit of protection, favours, more food rations and things, and that instantly set the other inmates against them. So Harry Hawley was a theatre worker from Berlin, and in 1939 a friend of his, a friend who also worked in theatre, who was trans, whose name was Susie, she was stabbed to death by hooligans after she was denounced. Denouncement was a very common thing in Germany. Some people did it as a way of getting revenge. somebody. Sometimes the Gestapo forced them into it, and very often the Gestapo would look through the houses of LGBT people for their address books, and they'd simply make, a knock on the door of everyone they found in there. Harry Pauli was denounced and sent to the Nussstrom camp for 15 months. That was his sentence, which he survived, and then he went back for another 8 months soon after that. He was drafted into the German army, but unfortunately it became common knowledge that he'd been convicted under paragraph 175. So he received constant homophobia. He was called a dirty faggot and a dirty swine constantly. And because of these experiences, he deserted twice, which he was lucky to get away with. So as punishment, he was sent to what was called a penal combat unit. So these were units that were sent, they weren't just sent to the front, they were sent to the very front of the front, and they were in almost constant fire from the enemy. And it was expected that people sent to these battalions wouldn't survive, but remarkably, Harry did survive that experience. So lesbians were often forced to work in camp brothels and were repeatedly raped. The gay men in the camps were painfully worked to death, either in a mine or some sort of manufactory, or if they were physically fit enough, then they were drafted into the army. But whatever activities they were compelled to do during the war, they were all deemed as expendable, and at some point they would all be eliminated. Something that Rudolf Hess did at Auschwitz, he would force the gay inmates to visit the camp bordellos, because he thought if they were to have sex with these prostitutes, it would straighten them out. And he was also of the view that the hard labour that they were given would straighten them out as well. Needless to say, it didn't work. So 1944 and 45 saw the liberation of the concentration and extermination camps. But what sort of liberation was this for their LGBT inmates? Well, they did experience further persecution and social exclusion. Unfortunately, many of them were re-imprisoned by the occupying forces. Something that the United States and Britain did when they took authority in the conquered Germany. They didn't regard concentration camps officially as prisons. So when they initially released the gay survivors, they said that they had to do all of their prison sentence that they were sentenced to all over again. Even though these sentences had been inflicted on them by Nazi courts, they still got them to carry out the full prison sentences. So it wasn't much of a liberation for many of them. Many of them were not welcome back into their homes and families because of the shame they brought them. Or should I say the shame that the families felt because of them. And very often they kept their experiences to themselves. And of course, one of the ways of being able to deal with trauma is being able to talk about it, get things out into the open. But they weren't able to do that in many cases. Pierre was a Roman Catholic, and he went to talk to his priest about his experiences, and the priest had no interest, wouldn't give him absolution for any of his sins. And he eventually married because of the pressure from his family, and the marriage was doomed to failure. Him and his wife couldn't connect physically or emotionally, and it was horrible for him. He wrote that I did not dare reveal anything about myself. I was already starting to censor my memories and depute my expectations. Despite all the things that I had imagined, despite the emotions of my homecoming, which I had looked forward to for such a long time, despite all that, liberation was for others. And he continued, we all acted as if nothing had happened. My homosexual label was known to the entire family. My reintegration into the family embarrassed the most bigoted relatives, and those most concerned about our public image. At family events, for a while he had to endure humiliation and anti-gay jokes, and he was also disinherited as well. He wrote about social situations, maybe meeting people for the first time. He said, instantly there were always three questions fired at me. Where were you imprisoned? For what reason? And do you get a pension? The French government gave a pension to all camp survivors. Of course, they had to apply for them first. But in order to get it, they had to disclose an awful lot of information about why they were in prison. And because of that, I mean, he was physically exhausted, really quite physically disabled, struggled to work, so he lived in a state of poverty for the rest of his life. So, in the West, part of Germany occupied by the West, lesbian, gay, transgender, bisexual people were pathologized having a mental disorder of some sort, or as criminally deviant behaviours, so they either required punishment or treatment. In the Stalinist East, LGBT activity was regarded as the pastime of the bourgeoisie that didn't have enough to do with themselves. Homosexuality had been decriminalised by the Bolsheviks at the Russian Revolution. It was recriminalised by Stalin in 1933. So many of those who ended up in the East were sent to prison camps and labour camps. So liberation really was not liberation in the truest sense of the word. So going forward in time a little bit, go on to the modern gay liberation movement, which started in earnest in 1968, and this was born out of 3 days of rioting at the Stonewall in New York. And it was the result of constant police harassment, and it was inspired by the civil rights movement. So in some parts of the world, the LGBT community was able to attain some rights and acceptance, and in 1990, 70% of British people were in favour of gay rights, and then in 2010, that went up to 90%. So progress was being made. But something happened in recent years that has stalled this. 2016, The Guardian ran the following headline: homophobic attacks in the UK rose 147% in the 3 months after the Brexit vote. It was a very interesting time. For the first time in 15 years, 2 weeks after Brexit, I received myself 3 lots of direct homophobic abuse. I hadn't been called a fucking queer since I was in my early 20s, but there was something about that time. And friends of mine from ethnic minorities suddenly felt a bit nervous. There was something in the air. And I'm not making any statements here on whether Brexit was a good thing or a bad thing, but there was something about it. Maybe it was something about the campaign that emboldens those that want to persecute minority groups. It was a difficult time, a very worrying time. But in terms of our current political establishment, anti-gay, anti-LGBT attitudes exist right across the political spectrum, even in the mainstream. Not immune to it. I've taken some headlines here from around the time of the general election just to highlight this. The Tory MP, Isle of Wight MP Andrew Turner drops out of election after telling pupils homosexuality is wrong, as if it's a choice. Conservative LGBT activists raised fears over DUP's appalling record on gay rights. Lib Dem here is Brian Paddock, who is the UK's most senior gay police officer, resigns over Farron's views on homosexuality. Jared O'Mara, MP, suspended by the Labour Party over homophobic and sexist comments. So it's all across the political establishment to varying degrees. But the further you go along the political spectrum towards the right, there is more overt homophobia. I've got a few more headlines here, and see if you can spot what they've all got in common. Former UKIP candidate Julia Gasper questions whether the only gay Holocaust victims were Jews. UKIP suspends councillor who claimed floods were caused by gay marriage. That was a councillor down in Henley-on-Thames who believed that the floods in 2014 were divine retribution for gay marriage. Exclusive, UKIP candidate Alan Craig to speak at a gay cure event. Gay UKIP member quits party over vile, nasty, homophobic candidate. UKIP's LGBT group attacks the selection of candidates who compares gays to Nazis. I wasn't surprised by the comparison, I was surprised that UKIP had an LGBT section. LGBT equality has gone too far, says new UKIP leader Henry Bolton, who I believe is about to become an ex-UKIP leader. UKIP politician banned from the Welsh Assembly after attacking nutty transgender people in vile speech. And then a slightly older headline. This is about the Christian People's Alliance. Religious party leader said, rise up against the cultural domination of the gay Stapo. the gay Gestapo, pretty sick, isn't it? Now that was Alan Craig, who was later to become a UKIP candidate. He was still received into UKIP, even though his opinions were known. And then there's Britain First. Britain First, very interesting in their stance on LGBT rights. I think we're slightly confused, actually, because this headline is weird. Britain First attacks blind date for including lesbians, attacks ISIS for killing gays. Don't know what that's about. Maybe it's just ISIS, they're not like ISIS killing gays, maybe it's okay for other people too. I don't know. They tend to contradict themselves, Britain First, a little bit. I watched a recent rant by Jay DeFranson on YouTube where she disrespectfully went into a Muslim shop that was selling books and what have you, and she was having a real rant that they were selling anti-gay literature. And then a rant the following week, she was going on about her irritations with, I think it was the current or past Lord Mayor of Belfast. And every other sentence included the fact that he was gay, and that had absolutely nothing to do with what she was talking about, that she was trying to use his sexuality against him. So we've heard quite a bit from history, and even recent history, unfortunately, about homosexuality being a disease, a deviant type of behaviour. And I think it's really important to hold on to the facts, hold on to what the Royal College of Psychiatrists, who are foremost authority in the land when it comes to mental illness, a position statement they released in 2014. I do like this statement. Sexual orientation is determined by a combination of biological and postnatal environmental factors. There's no evidence to go beyond this and impute any kind of choice into the origins of sexual orientation. They wish to clarify that homosexuality is not a psychiatric disorder. In 1973, the American Psychiatric Association concluded that there's no scientific evidence that homosexuality was a disorder, and removed it from its diagnostic glossary of mental disorders. And the World Health Organization doing the same in 1992. The college holds the view that lesbian, gay, and bisexual people are and should be regarded as valued members of society who have exactly similar rights and responsibilities as other citizens. And they conclude by saying that rejection by friends, families, and others, such as employees, means that some lesbian, gay, and bisexual people experience a greater than expected prevalence of mental health and substance misuse problems. So, of course, homophobia, transphobia, biphobia is very bad for our mental health. We can't flourish as people, we can't participate in society and fully contribute and activate our potential unless this hostility is removed. So do we need to worry about the future? I've got a bit of a feeling that we do. I've got rather a long quote here, I won't read all of this, from Brian Sheehan, who's the co-chair of the International Lesbian and Gay Association, Europe's Executive Board. I'll just read the last paragraph. In the countries at the bottom of our country ranking on LGBT rights, the LGBTI people and their families are faced with a scenario where their rights are actively being eroded. ILGA Europe's latest Rainbow Europe package also contains a stark reminder that Europe is not just damaged by the slowing legislative process. The absence of supportive laws and politics is one thing. The legalisation of oppression is another threat altogether. Regressive laws targeting both individuals and the work of LGBTI activists and NGOs are a pernicious and real threat in many European countries. So what can we do as individuals, and what can we do as groups? Well, we can get inspired by the range of activities commemorating Holocaust Memorial Day, and we can even plan our own in our local communities. We can challenge hatred where we encounter it, and we can pledge to remember the victims. That's very important in the face of Holocaust denial. Remembering, of course, denial is one of the 8 stages of genocide. We can visit places like Yad Vashem and Auschwitz, and we can learn about what happens in these places, and we can share this. We can also get active and interested in politics. And we can also look out for and participate in the LGBTI History Month activities that are coming up. And if you're part of the LGBTI community and you feel it's safe and appropriate enough for you to do so, then live as such and come out of the closet. It's very, very difficult to hate people when you actually know them. And I think that's probably been my personal contribution for the last 20 years as living as an out gay man. I've been able to challenge some of people's stereotypes about what it is to be gay. And we can complain when we hear language which creates conflict and report hate crime. And above all, we can speak up and speak out. That's all I have.